In our last video, we looked at the basics of responsive web design. We looked at the meta viewpoint tag, and we also looked at media queries. Now, a common thing that we're going to do is actually use a CSS framework. Now, there's a lot of different frameworks out there. I want to show you the most popular one, and you might see why it's so popular starting out. Now, I've used this framework since version 3. And they have come out with 4 and now 5 and done minor updates. So it's actually on 5.2 as of this recording. So it may change over time, but I want to show this to you real quick. This is Bootstrap, and you can get Bootstrap at getbootstrap.com, and it gives you all the information you need in order to start working with this. Now, there's a lot of ways to start off with Bootstrap, a lot of new things that you can do. If you're familiar with things like NPM and other things, you can use that. You can use Sass in order to customize it. That's not really necessary. What we want to focus on is how do we get started with a very basic template that we can use. So instead of having to download files and import them, which is very easy, and they give you links to do that, I'm going to click on Read the Docs. And reading the docs are going to tell you how do you get started with Bootstrap. Now, they start with a very basic HTML5 document, one that already has that meta viewport tag associated with it. However, if you go down just a little bit, you can see how to include the CSS and the JavaScript that's required for the framework to be included from a CDN. A CDN is a content delivery network, and that means it's somewhere that's stored on someone else's servers that we're allowed to use. Now, I would not recommend doing this if you are a large site that's going to be having lots of visitors, because that's going to put unnecessary strain on that CDN that they're providing basically for free for you. So don't ruin a good thing. Use it appropriately. If you do have a really big site, you might want to look at a CDN for yourself in order to improve the performance of that site. So I'm just going to come in here and take this whole file, and I can select it like this, or I can come up here and say copy to clipboard, either one. Go into my code editor. I'm going to create a new file and just paste it. Notice that Visual Studio Code recognizes, hey, this is HTML stuff, and does all the color coding for me. I'm going to save this as template-responsive. I'm going to come in here and make a couple of little changes just so it kind of fits my own needs. So I'm going to specify responsive template with Bootstrap. Instead of hello world, I'm going to specify a header, a main section, and a footer. Notice I have not deleted any of my information. So up on line 7, I have a CDN link that goes out to my style sheet. On line 13, I have the JavaScript, and then I've just created my header, main, and footer for my page. Now, I could go in and create some styles if I want to, but I'm going to show you something how we're going to do it using the Bootstrap methodology. Now, you might think, okay, what is the Bootstrap method? Well, the idea is that it's going to lay things out into columns. You have columns to line things up to 12 of them, and any combination up to 12 can be used. So I can break things up into sections and maybe have 2 columns wide, so I have 6 items in a horizontal row. I could say, well, I want to split this page up into thirds, in which case I'll use 4 columns for each of the visible columns. I might just say, you know what, I want the whole thing. Give me all 12. So Bootstrap is going to have a lot of flexibility. It increases that flexibility when you realize that you can nest it. So could I put 12 individual columns inside of one column that's a 1/12 of its overall width? Yes, but it would be so small, it'd be very, very hard to use. So I want to be kind of mindful of how am I using this to make it the most effective. So I have my main information here. Let's see how I can use these columns in some other built-in classes, because this CSS framework is going to do everything with classes. Let's start off by doing a header. And the easy way to do something like this is to look on my left-hand side and see what is it that I'm looking for. How do I want to lay things out? Notice I have sections, for example, for layout, and I can look at the breakpoints. How are things being broken down? Because it's a mobile-first CSS framework, it's going to always work on a mobile device, and that's what it's geared towards. Then we can make it do things for larger devices. You can see that we're going to use prefixes to help us define what our minimum and maximum widths are going to be. Whether it's just the extra small, which is default, a very small cell phone type size if you would. Small and medium would be for more of your premier phones, getting into maybe small tablets. Large is going to be either a larger tablet or maybe a windowed browser. And then extra large and extra large would be for full screen desktop environments. So that's what your breakpoints are. So there are a couple of types of containers. One that specifies how wide do I want this to be, and then also a container-fluid. My container-fluid says take up 100% of my width of my screen. So this can be very, very beneficial depending upon what it is I'm trying to do. If I see this right here, I can kind of see how this is going to be broken down. And, what happens if I'm smaller than that maximum size? Well, then I just take up 100%. But if I get above that maximum size, notice that it limits me. It sets a max width. That way, if I don't want to have my content that's really, really wide and hard to see, I can work with it. So let me show you where I'm going to use container fluid. I'm going to use this on my header. There's container fluid. And I'm also going to use it on my class for my footer. So both of these, I'm allowing me to kind of set up that they're going to be full width no matter what. Now my main, I'm going to say, you know what? I probably don't want to have a container fluid. I don't want it to be full maximum width. So I'll come in here and say class equals container. And notice I get a couple of options in here that I can pick. I'm going to pick medium just so we can see kind of a difference. Now you might say, well, how did it know to go pick that? Well, in this case, Visual Studio Code is going out, reading in that CSS and says, ooh, I recognize all these classes. They don't have to be classes that you created. It recognizes them from other style sheets. So you can import something in and use it like that. Now, in order to learn about my columns, I clicked on the columns navigation menu. And I have sub-navigation on my right-hand side if you're interested. So you can learn how to reorder them, offset them, things like that. We're just going to keep it very simple in this case. But as I read through this, I can see how do I use these columns. And you can see some examples of this. Well, you'll notice that I need to have a div that has a class of row. And then I specify how many columns I want to display. Now, if I just say COL, it's going to break it into evenly spaced columns. Or remember, I'm allowed up to 12 minor columns that I can contain and add together in any way up to 12. So I can say call dash and then a value. If I need to specify breakpoints depending upon the size of my screen. So maybe I'll have 4 columns on a large screen, but just 2, and I'll stack them one on top of each other for a smaller screen, then I can use those prefixes that we saw before. Here's an example of that they provide for you, where I can have 4 columns if I have a space that is wide enough to support it, but I can do 2 columns in 2 rows if I have a space that's smaller, for example, a cell phone or a mini tablet. And so notice that they're using these prefixes. In this case, it's call, the prefixes before the number I want to show in order to do that. I also have a way to force the columns to break into a new line if necessary. I'm going to come back here to Visual Studio Code. I have container fluid for my footer. and I'm going to say div class row. And then if you remember correctly, in our previous examples, we had a footer and we had like some legal information, some contact information, and we had to put them one on top of each other. I would really like to have those information in two separate columns. So I'll say div class col, C-O-L, and that's going to give me one column, and here I can put legal info. And then I'll have my second column here for my contact info. When I load up my information, you'll notice here that it displays my page. I have two columns. Right now my header and my main are empty, so they're not showing anything. Now, as I put information into it, obviously my footer would be pushed down. But I can do some other things with this to make it so it's automatically pushed down. Under my helper section, I have a page on positioning. So I can position things so they're fixed to the top or bottom of the screen. That means that as I scroll, they're not going to move. That means if my content's not big enough, it automatically goes down. So I can do a fixed bottom or a fixed top. So I'm going to come down here under my footer, in addition to class container-fluid, I'm going to say fixed bottom. And then for my header, I'm going to go ahead and say fixed top. Now, obviously I don't have anything in my header yet, so we're not going to see that. But when I come back to my browser window, reload this, you say, oh, where did my text go? Well, if I scroll down to the bottom, I can see my legal info and my contact info down there. So it allows me very easily to work with that. Now, if you want to go ahead and set up your nav bar and part of your header, it's very easy to do. If we look over here under components, there is a nav bar section. Now, there's a lot of different things that you can do with the nav bar inside of Bootstrap. They have lots of configurations, but by default, the nice thing is that it's responsive in nature. So let's take a look at how we're going to do this. Notice that they give you an example of what it would look like to have drop-down menus, disabled items, and even a search bar. That might be a little bit too complicated for you, but we can come in here with it copied. We can go into our editor and paste this. Now I only pull out the things I don't need. So for example, I don't need this form, so I'm going to remove it. Here you can see I have a nav link that's disabled. That's what's making it show up as disabled. I can remove this list item if I want and go through this. Here's a drop-down menu. I don't need the drop-down menu. I can remove that whole piece one section at a time. Just focusing on my current pages and links. You'll notice that it gives me a built-in button, different things like that. I do have here an anchor for my nav bar, and it's showing up as nav bar text. I can replace this with an image if I want. I'm going to say image source images. I'm going to say logo.png, and I'm going to say class equals logo. When I load this, you notice that my logo is huge. I need to adjust that. But I do have my navigation. It's using that hamburger link, which is very common. I click on it, I can see my options. So to fix this, I need to create my own style. However, you might think, well, wait a second, you've got a style sheet, but it's on another server. I can't make that change. How do I work with this? Well, that's very easy. I'm going to create a new file. And if I am of class logo, and I might want to specify if I'm in a nav bar that's a logo. Right now we're just going to keep it simple. So if I'm a logo, I'll say max width is 32 pixels, max height 32 pixels, and I'm going to call this styles2.css. Then inside my template responsive, after my style sheet that I have that's for Bootstrap, I'm going to come in here and say link href styles2.css rel style sheet. Now if I come back here and reload, you can see what it looks like. A smaller logo. It's very large, so I can use it other places, but I can make all my adjustments. And this is kind of the idea of what I want. What's nice is if I get rid of this and say, well, what does it look like as a desktop? Notice that my navigation bar still shows, but now instead of being hidden links, I see the links that I can use automatically. Now, do I have to put my logo inside of my nav bar? Of course not. I can hide things based upon how big something is or how small something is. I can go in and make other changes based upon what I need to. This is very, very flexible. In fact, if I come here and look at my nav bar, you'll notice that I have BG Light. This is actually a style that's given to us by default to show a light style background border. I can actually use a dark color scheme, so if I want to use something dark, I can use that. I can say, when does my nav bar expand? It expands when I hit that large size. I could make it something different if I want. So there's a lot of control that you get in making something like this. What other things could I do? Well, I could obviously come in here and add some additional links. Just like I would normally set up my template, I can specify my links. You'll notice that Bootstrap, however, wants to use an unordered list and then have a list of links. They take care of what happens with things like the little bulleted points or little disk if you prefer. They hide all that stuff. They have all the links to do it. Now, the one thing that some people say that they don't like about a CSS framework is notice how many classes are you having to use. There's a lot. That's a downside to a framework, but they've thought all this out, and if you look at large websites, they tend to have lots of classes in order to get that refined approach that they're looking for. Let's look at what we're going to do inside the main real quick if I want to have some text. So notice I have my container-md, and I'm going to put just a couple of little sections here. So inside my main, I'm going to say div class row. Remember, inside my container, I need to have a row. Then inside my rows, I'm going to define my columns. Now, I'm going to want to have two columns. And if you've seen a lot of websites, they have a major section and then a sidebar that's a little bit narrower. So I'm going to demonstrate that real quick. I'm going to specify article, class. Now, in a case like this, how big do I want my columns to be? It's going to depend upon, am I on a phone or something else? So on a phone, I'm going to say col-12. Because I want it to be full width. But if I'm on maybe like a large iPad or maybe on a desktop environment, I'll do col-md-8. And that's my article. For my sidebar, I'll say div class equals col12, because once again, if I'm that excess, that extra small by default, I want to specify, hey, I'm going to be full width. But if I'm something else, -md-4. So this is going to be for my sidebar. So notice I'm applying two different classes to it. Could I put an additional class in here? You bet. So I could come over here and say, you know what, I'm going to have a class called sidebar. Now that class doesn't actually exist yet. I have to create it, but I could do something different with that. For example, I might come over here and say, okay, you know what, sidebar, background color, and I'm going to do a very, very light change. So instead of saying FFF, which is white, I'm going to say EEE, which is kind of that little gray. But then I'm going to do a border dash left, and I'm going to say something like 1 pixel. Come in here and do 777, so it's kind of a grayish, and then I'll do a solid. Now if I come back to my responsive template, I'm not seeing anything because I don't have any text in there yet. I got to put some text in there. So I'm going to just grab just a little bit of text here. This first part for my article. And then I'll grab just a couple little things for my sidebar as well. Now if I come in here, you can see this information. Now because I have that sticky top and sticky bottom, my main section actually has a small issue. It's sitting on top of it. And so I need to create some margin. That's easy enough to do. I'm going to come in here, do main, do margin, my top and bottom. I'm going to say 50 pixels, and I'm going to say 0 pixels. Okay, just to create some little spacing in here. Now, is there something in Bootstrap that probably does this for me? Yes. Would I need to go through that whole process and look at it to find it? Yes. So this is just a quick little fix. And I can see, oh, I'm a lot closer. I actually need a little bit more than 50 pixels, but I'm pretty close to what I need there. What else can I do just real quick looking at this? Well, you can see there's a lot of different things. Everything from buttons, and I can define how I want my buttons to look. You don't have to use a button just in forms. You can use them for links, and they actually will show you how to do that and how to make a button look like a link if you want to, or make it look like a button. They're going to give you some information on using things like assistive technologies. How do we make it so it's more accessible to people who may have some sort of visual impairment, whether they be colorblind, they're visually impaired and they can't see anything at all, or maybe some other type of thing that's going to prevent them from a normal experience. We want them to still be able to experience the website. Bootstrap has done a great job of providing extra classes and tools for you to learn on how to make things more accessible. Here's a perfect example of that. You also have things like alerts. It's not a button, but you're wanting to put a warning. So maybe you just did a file upload, like, hey, here's an upload warning. You just upload your file, or you couldn't upload this file, it's too big. You got to give them a warning about it. Maybe it's a success. Hey, this file was successfully uploaded. Maybe you're wanting to let them know, hey, look at me. This is important. We've got a sale coming up on the 5th. Now, there's other things you can do. They have cards where you can have an image associated with it and a card of text, information that goes about it. You can look at things like this. You can look at other things like other types of navigation and tabs. How do you incorporate tabs into a web page? You can do things like, how do I want to justify my navigation to be on the right-hand side versus the left-hand side? You have all different types of things that you can look at. Now, these are the default colors for Bootstrap. These are changeable. Typically, you're either going to go in and use Sass or maybe CSS variables in order to control this. Bootstrap gives you lots of information on that. Or you can create a separate CSS file like we showed you and then place your styles in that. This is going to have information for doing with components as well as regular text, backgrounds, etc. You can see those. Additionally, there's a whole section on just doing forms. How can you stylize a form to make it easier to view? They have sections on doing radio buttons and checkboxes, so that it's a lot better than the defaults that HTML is going to give you. They have sections on doing input groups, which is how do we combine things. So you can say, for example, like at a username, or provide a username at and then a built-in email address you're expecting. You can do things like setting up a range. If you remember when we talked about numbers and ranges, this is a built-in way. It's a whole lot easier than looking at numbers. Give me on a sliding scale, how well did you like this? And then it associates a number with it. So you're, instead of asking someone on a scale of 1 to 5, they go, oh, I liked it about this much. So there's a lot of interesting things that we can do and how we can set these up. There's a whole section on images and how you apply images. Now, some things are set up by default, but you also have things like your image thumbnail, aligning your images, different things like that that you can look at, as well as tables. So if you want to set up different tables, whether it has striped columns, striped rows, none of that information. Some borders and not others. All that is set up using tables, classes, and the built-in features of Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is going to give you a lot of variabilities and a lot of control over how you can stylize something, keeping in mind that it's designed to work with a mobile device first. So if you need something that's been already done for you, this is a great way to get started. Hope this helps in getting started building a web page with a CSS framework. Whether you choose Bootstrap or something else, you just need to go to their website, look up their documentation, and see how it's going to work. The biggest thing I always recommend when using a framework is make sure it is still actively supported. You do not want to start with a CSS framework that's not been worked on in the last 5 or 10 years when technology is constantly changing on the web. Otherwise, you're going to be good. I will give you one big warning. I've given you a small warning, which is, remember, there's lots of classes that get involved and you can't memorize them all, so you've got a lot of good examples. Your bigger warning is because Bootstrap is being actively maintained. They do change versions from time to time. As I mentioned earlier, I started on version 3 and I've used version 4 and now I've used version 5 on a wide variety of projects. Bootstrap has helped save me an untold number of hours in simplifying a lot of work that's already been done for me, and I'm greatly appreciative to them for that. However, when they move from one version to the next, it rarely is backwards compatible, which means that I can't just point the new CSS document. The number of changes that they have made have been significant enough that I have to start over and relay out everything. So typically, if I build something and I start in version 4, if I've just got a couple pages, I may upgrade it to version 5. But I had one website that had hundreds of pages, and it would have just been too time-consuming to work on. Therefore, I kept it in version 4, which was still very good, and my new projects went to version 5. It's just a matter of what you've worked with and done over time. So keep that in mind when you're working with it. Now, the minor versions, so things like 5.1, 5.2, most of those are minor fixes, and those you can make the changes to. You just point to the new file. So don't worry about that. It's just when you go to a full version update that usually it's not backwards compatible, and you have to do a lot of new layout, or you have to deal with making some changes. So remember, if it's a point layout, you can usually just point to the new file and get the updated features, maybe some fixes that they found that either because a browser changed versions itself, or they found that, oh, this didn't work on an older version of browser and now it's more compatible with more browsers. It's only when they have the full point version upgrade. So when they go from 4 to 5 or 3 to 4, in the future it's going to be from 5.2 to 6.0. When that happens, realize that you're probably going to either have to say, you know what, I need to stick with the old version, or I'm going to have to do some major updates. Which one you pick is going to be dependent upon a couple of factors. Do you need the new features that are in the next version? And how much time and effort are you willing to put into it? A company who's trying to stay on the leading edge might be saying, yes, I'm willing to put that money into it, put that time into it to make it work. Other companies, they may not. So just keep that in mind. All right? And good luck with your projects.